Hello, my name is Freddy Salmon Mejage from Edukea Tanzania. Welcome in this session to proceed with our second topic in Form 5 history, which is Africa and Europe in the 15th century. So on the last session we ended on looking the reasons that led or that widened the gap between Africa and Europe in development by 15th century onwards. So now we are going to see another reason which was widen the gap for the development in Europe and Africa by 15th century, which is new or post-colonialism. What is new colonialism or post-colonialism? Neo-colonialism is the process whereby a country is independent politically but economically still dominated by the strong nations. It means that neo-colonialism or post-colonialism is the process whereby a country is independent politically only, but economically is dominated by the strong nation. Sometimes neo-colonialism is known as flag independence simply because these nations which are weak economically have no power to decide concerning their own development. It means that sometimes neo-colonialism or post-colonialism is sometimes called or known as flag independence. It means that sometimes neo-colonialism is known as flag independence simply because these nations which have weak economic or which have weak economies have no power to decide what they have to do concerning with their own development. So they depend on the strong nations to support them in economy, and they gave them conditions which must be followed in order to get the economical or financial assistance from those strong nations. Let us see the concepts which were under new colonialism that widened the gap between Africa and Europe in 15th century onwards. The first one was African leaders acted as puppet leaders for their former colonial masters. It means that after the end or after the attainment of independence in many African countries, it means that the many African leaders become the puppets of their former colonies. And the fact is that some African leaders after independence are still cooperating with the Europeans to exploit African resources and protect the interests of Europeans. It means that the fact is that after the independence of many African countries, the leaders of African nations have become or have been still cooperating with the European nations in exploiting the African resources and protecting the interests of the Europeans or the new colonialists. For example, the late Mobutu Sese Seko in former Zaire, now DRC Congo or Democratic Republic of Congo, that leader was the puppet leader for the European interests or for the European nation. Collected resources for France and for himself. It means that leader Mobutu Sese Seko in DRC Congo or Democratic Republic of Congo by now collected resources for the Congolese to give for French or their former colonies known as France and for himself. It means collected the resources of Congo nation or of Congolese. Yes, we are proceeding. It means that the African leaders were protecting the interests of Europeans. as I have given you example of Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, in former Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, we are collecting the resources of Congo for France and for himself. Foday Senko of Sierra Leone, Charles Taylor of Liberia were the another examples of puppet readers who were collecting the resources of their nations and for their benefits and the benefits of their former colonies. Another concept that was in neocolonialism was neocolonialism also used by the, it means also neocolonialism is also used by the economically developed countries such as USA, which has world's financial institutions like International Monetary Fund and World Bank to devaluate local currencies in Africa and giving add conditions to African countries so that they can ensure that Africa remains underdeveloped and dependent to those European nations. It means that also neocolonialism has been used by the economically developed countries such as USA, which are the world financial institutions like International Monetary Fund and World Bank, which devaluate the local currencies of the African countries and currencies in Africa and giving the added conditions for the African countries so that they can ensure the African countries remain underdeveloped and dependent to their donor countries. So you can see that African countries are being provided with the added conditions which must be followed in order to get the financial assistance from those financial institutions or international financial institutions like World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And the Africans' currencies are being devaluated in order to ensure that the African nations are still underdeveloped and dependent to them. And then another one is globalization and privatization. It means that neocolonialism has become with or has come with the globalization and the privatization. This also led to underdevelopment of African continent and development of European continent. To mean that globalization and the privatization of public funds to the few people ends or to the capitalists have become the another factor that has been widening the gap in development between Africa and Europe, whereby globalization have been they're making the world to be the small area or to be as a village. So the African countries have become globalized by the European countries, whereby the African countries have acted as the dumping area for the manufactured goods. The new colonialism is insisting or ensuring that the Africans must be distracted in technological. So globalization has become with the technological advancement, whereby the European manufactured goods have been imported in African countries so that the African technology could be collapsed or undermined. But also globalization has become the factor for the widening the gap between Europe and Africa in development, because globalization has been increased the interconnection of the people all over the world. It means that the people have been got the freedom of movement and the interconnection between the people of the world, whereby there have been free movement of the people, freedom of trade, freedom of market, and the freedom of competing between the companies and the institutions in the world. So in that way, the European companies and the industries have been competing with the African markets. So because of the African goods and services which have been produced is low quality or have low quality compared to the European goods and services. So that has been leading to the collapse of African market. Through globalization, Africa has become a market for European manufactured goods that have low quality, and also it has resulted to deterioration of African culture. It means that globalization in Africa, or through globalization in Africa, has become the market for European manufactured goods. So you can see that until now, African nations are just the area for dumping the European manufactured goods, which have become the problem for African nations to develop. So you can see that the many European manufactured goods have been imported to African countries, and that made the competition in searching for markets between the local made goods of Africans and the European manufactured goods. And because of African goods have the low quality, that has led to the decline of African economy, and the market of Africans have been taken by the European powers. And also globalization has led to the deterioration of African culture and imposed the Western culture or European culture, so that the African in social aspect have been underdeveloped because their culture or their local traditions and the customs have been discarded and replaced by the European culture. So that's how we can see that globalization and the privatization as the umbrella of neocolonialism have widened the gap between Africa and Europe in development. So these were the reasons which have been widening the gap in the development of Africa and Europe from 15th century until now. So let us see the impacts of widening gap of development between Africa and Europe. What are the impacts which have been related as the result of widening the gap between Africa and Europe in development? The first one, as it led to introduction of an increased slave trade in Africa. It means that the widening gap of development between Africa and Europe have brought the introduction of an increased slave trade in Africa. It means that during transatlantic slave trade, the slaves were taken at a large extent, and Africa remained with low population, and because the people who had able and were large in number were taken as the slaves to offer their labor in the plantations and mining centers which were established in America. So you can see that the slave trade have been increased as the result of what? Of widening gap of development between Africa and Europe. Another impact is related to the increase and the expansion of an equal exchange between Africa and Europe. It means that the increase and the expansion of an equal exchange between Europe and Africa have been increased, because until now there is the importation and the exportation of goods from abroad to Africa and from Africa to abroad consecutively, whereby there is an equal exchange. You can find that there is aids which have been provided by the donor countries like United States of America, China, Germany, France in African countries, while the African countries in turn they are providing their natural resources like gold, copper, diamond, silver and tanzanite to those donor countries, and that made the African countries to remain underdeveloped. And there are countries in the Middle East or in Africa, in the Arabic nations which are Africa in nature, like Libya, Morocco, Cameroon. These are countries which are offering the oil offering the oil or the main producer of oil, and the donor countries or European countries are the main exploiter of those natural resources in African countries. So you can see that the development of African countries is difficult because of that European and eco-exchange system that was introduced by that time. Another impact, it has led to the destruction of African technology and local industries. It means that the widening of gap of development between Africa and Europe in the 15th century onwards has led to the destruction of African culture and African technology and the local industries. It means that as the result of long distance trade or transatlantic slave trade, as the many Africans were transported or uprooted from Africa to America, those people who could participate in African technology or participate in production of goods using the African technology were taken as slaves to America to produce on behalf of the Europeans, and Africans or African continent remained with no productive forces who could use the local technology and participate in local industries produce the African goods and service for themselves. So that has marked the destruction of African technology and the local industries. But another, it led to the destruction of African culture and the introduction of European culture. It means that the widening of gap between Europe and Africa in development has led to the destruction of African culture and the introduction of European culture. It was the period when colonialism and new colonialism was being introduced in Africa, whereby the Europeans was distracted the African culture and brought the European culture. So the Africans have been adapting adapting the European culture, which have been undermining the African culture and the traditions which they had. So the European culture have been taking place or replaced the African culture, and that led to the underdevelopment of African countries. But another is led to introduction of legitimate trade after the abolition of slave trade, in which Africans continued to be affected. It means that scenario or mercantilism, colonialism, and the neocolonialism has led to the introduction of legitimate trade after the abolition of slave trade, in which Africans continued or progressed to be affected by the legitimate trade which was introduced. And that legitimate trade was increased the exploitation of African resources, whereby an equal exchange or the bringing or importing of priceless goods in Africa and exporting the valuable resources from Africa was taking place and was increased at a large extent. So the Africans have been exploited and affected by that legitimate trade. Another one was, it led to introduction of colonialism in Africa. It means that the gap that was there between Africa and Europe led to the introduction of colonialism in Africa. It means that in the 19th century, the African countries experienced the colonization of their continent, whereby Berlin Conference that conducted in 1884 up to 1885, that was discussed about dividing and ruling or dominating African continent, was conducted in Berlin under the supervision of Otto von Bismarck as the chancellor of that conference. And the African continent were started to be colonized by the European powers. So that was the impact of the gap between Africa and Europe in development from the 15th century onwards. Another was, African continent is still a market of European manufactured goods and area to invest capital and a dumping price for European outdated products and goods of low quality. It means that African continent until now has been still the place where the European manufactured goods have been dumped in the area for investment for the surplus capital of European powers. So the African continent have become the area for market of European manufactured goods, as well as the area for investment of European surplus capital in order to ensure there is maximization of profit for the European interest. As well, and also the Europeans have been importing the outdated products and goods of low quality in African countries, and that was become or as regarded as the result of gap or the widened gap between Africa and Europe in development from the 15th century onwards. And the last one is, through neo-colonialism, African continent is still dominated by the big powers in all aspects of life by using ways such as militarism, whereby European former colonial masters tend to come to Africa for peacekeeping and training African soldiers through Structural Adjustment Program or SAP. It means that through neo-colonialism, the African continent is still dominated by big powers, indirect methods or indirect ways, whereby economically the African continent is still dominated, whereby there is the freedom of trade or trade liberalization, whereby there is freedom of trading activities and the free movement of people, goods and services from one place to another or from one country to another, or as well as from the one continent to another. This has become the result of neo-colonialism. Also in African countries there was the establishment of political dependence, whereby the African continent were provided with the condition that they have social. The culture of African continents or African countries have been destroyed and distracted and replaced by the European culture, whereby the Africans have started to adapt or to imitate the European culture and to discard their local or traditional culture, so that was the impact or the result of neo-colonialism. So you can see that the other European countries, it means that some European countries have been establishing the military base or armies in African countries in order to ensure the interests of the Europeans or European countries are being protected by those military bases which are introduced in African countries. For example, USA has been introduced the military base in Kenya so as to defend or to protect the interests of United States of America interest, and acting or deceiving the Africans that they are keeping the peace and the stability of African countries. As well as in Congo, you can see that until now there is conflicts whereby the European powers are using that chance as acting, they are maintaining peace and security of the country, while they are using that chance to fetch and exploit the natural resources present in Congo. We can experience various conflicts which are still operating or taking place in many African countries, but on the back or on the back of curtain there is the support of European powers, and use that chance to exploit and take out the natural resources of Africans in order to make the Africans underdeveloped and make themselves prospering and developing in all aspects of life. So these all things which have been done by the big powers of the world, like European countries like Britain, USA, Portugal, France, Germany, Italy, has become as a result of neo-colonialism, and As it is the end of our topic, so I would like to give you some questions, which are two questions. The first one is, explain the impacts of the widened gap between Europe and Africa in development from 15th century onwards. And the second one, show how globalization is manifesting the gap between Africa and Europe in development. So until there, I would like to say that this is the end of our lesson. Thank you for being with me. I welcome you in the next session. Some questions which you have to perform.